I was once speaking with a scholar who described a scene in Tehran during the height of the Arab uprisings. He spoke of these grand mirrored halls where Iranian officials would lean across mahogany tables, eyes bright with conviction, talking about a great Islamic awakening. To hear them tell it, Iran wasn't just a Persian Shia power, it was the visionary vanguard for the entire Muslim world, a pan-Islamic leader meant to unite every believer from Cairo to Jakarta. They didn't see themselves as sectarian firebrands, they saw themselves as the big brothers of the Middle East, moving beyond the petty divisions of Sunni and Shia to lead a billion-strong collective. There was a certain gravity to their words, a sense of, finally, our moment has arrived. They insisted that their support for regional movements was about justice, not identity. But then, as the conversation shifted to the actual battlefields of Syria and Iraq, the atmosphere in the room changed. You'd mentioned the specific militias being funded, the slogans being chanted on the front lines, and the names of the groups, Hezbollah, the Badr Organization, the Shia mobilization units. Suddenly, the grand pan-Islamic rhetoric started to feel like a suit that didn't quite fit. While the officials in Tehran were painting a masterpiece of regional unity, the commanders on the ground were playing a much grittier, much more specific card. It reminds me of a biting comment I heard during a heated debate on this very topic. A man can think of himself as incredibly handsome, but that doesn't mean the mirror or the world agrees with him. Iran insists it is the protector of all Islam, yet its most powerful tools are increasingly, undeniably sectarian. It raises a haunting question that defines the modern Middle East. Is Iran a frustrated visionary being dragged into a sectarian war it never wanted, or has the handsome mask of the revolution finally slipped to reveal a power that can only survive by deepening the very divisions it claims to despise?
That tension. I mean, that's it, isn't it? That enormous, sometimes paralyzing gap between the revolutionary vision and the strategic reality. That is exactly the space we're going to unpack today.
Right.
When you really dig in, you see a state struggling constantly to maintain an ideological facade, while at the same time executing this remarkably cold, pragmatic regional strategy focused on concrete survival.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're not just analyzing political narratives anymore. We are shifting the focus entirely to what Iran actually prioritizes and builds. Our mission for you, the listener, is really to move beyond these abstract labels.
Exactly. We've got three interconnected ideas to guide this deep dive. First, we need to establish the framework for this contradiction. We have to understand how Iran cycles between this grand ideological posturing and, well, genuine realist pragmatism.
And that cycle is dictated by what's happening at home and abroad.
Precisely. It's dictated by internal factionalism and external threats. Yeah. It's a survival mechanism.
Yeah. And it's crucial to see how that strategy has moved on. It's not about revolutionary export anymore. It's about results.
Which brings us to our second point. We're going to pivot entirely to quantifiable reality. We're going to evaluate Iranian influence not through political speeches about unity, but through hard infrastructure.
You mean literal roads?
Literal roads, military bases, tunnels. The logistics required to build a secure land corridor to the Mediterranean. It's all about physical control and state capacity.
The physical manifestation of power, replacing the abstract promise of the revolution. And finally, the instruments of that power.
Exactly. Third, we'll look at how Iran's support for regional militias isn't just ideological anymore. It's a calculated collective survival mechanism. We'll detail how the entire axis of resistance stays operational despite sanctions by relying on a decentralized structure and a really sophisticated multi-billion-dollar gray zone economy.
Let's start at the very foundation of the Islamic Republic, its institutional design since 1979. It's famously described as a political oxymoron. What does that actually mean? And how is it almost intentionally designed to create this constant internal tug of war?
The term political oxymoron gets right to the heart of it. It refers to this complex mixture of two entirely distinct systems operating at the same time. You have the political democratic bodies.
Like the elected presidency and the parliament, the moslems.
Right, and they exist alongside these powerful Islamic religious bodies. The supreme leader, the Council of Guardians.
So the whole system has this dual legitimacy, one from the ballot box and one essentially from God.
Precisely. And this structural dualism, it creates a perpetual state of friction. That's what we call factional competition. Yeah. The religious bodies, especially the Council of Guardians, they vet candidates, they vet legislation, all based on Islamic principles.
Which inherently constrains the whole democratic process.
It does. And it means that these factions, reformists, principalists, hardliners, they are constantly battling to define the country's direction. And that includes its foreign policy.
So the system is fundamentally set up for internal disagreement. How does that domestic friction translate into the foreign policy stances we see, that swing between the big pan-Islamic vision and pure pragmatism?
Well, factionalism acts as this critical, intervening variable, but is highly sensitive to the external environment. The core pattern is this. When Iran faces these overwhelming domestic imperatives, like the need for massive economic reconstruction,
Or just public anger over the economy.
right, or when the external environment is accommodating, factionalism tends to soften up. The policy then swings toward pragmatism, toward cooperation, because all the internal groups agree they need to engage to survive.
But if the outside world is hostile, or the domestic disagreement becomes too intense, the system retreats inward and hardens its rhetoric.
That's when the ideological posture comes roaring back, a challenging external environment. Intense diplomatic isolation, military threats, or outright war. It often forces the decision makers to coalesce, at least temporarily, and project an ideological foreign policy stance against the enemy.
So the language of the revolution, of Velayat Faqih, becomes the justification for what might actually be purely realist actions.
It's a signature move of the regime, blending ideological language over a pragmatic policy.
But doesn't that suggest that Iran is just uniquely ideological, unlike other states?
Not necessarily. I mean, the argument is that despite the role of religion, Iran is still committed to standard defensive realist imperatives most of the time. It's about the survival of the state.
Okay.
But the language used to express those imperatives, that changes drastically. It depends on whether the policy has a broad domestic consensus or if it's being driven by the need to manage internal disagreements. It's a pragmatic use of ideology as a tool.
That helps contextualize why the rhetoric can seem so divorced from the actions on the ground. Beyond the structural paradox, what are the deep historical constants that dictate Iran's strategic outlook, regardless of which faction is in charge?
There are two constant pillars, and they're rooted in Iran's history and geography. They really transcend any political personality. The first is this relentless drive for independence.
Right.
And that results in a feeling of what you could call strategic loneliness.
Right. Their constitution even mandates non-alignment. It's a rejection of foreign domination.
Exactly. A rejection of British, Russian, or American influence. And geopolitically, you have to remember, Iran is surrounded by 15 states. It often feels fundamentally encircled.
Look at the map. You've got Turkey, Russia, Iraq, the Arab countries across the Gulf.
It's a persistent syndrome of encirclement, and when you feel constantly threatened and you don't have a major alliance like NATO to protect you, your priority naturally shifts to self-reliance and strategic depth.
And the second constant is its identity, which just reinforces that sense of isolation.
Absolutely.
Yep.
The second constant is Iran's perception of exceptionalism. I mean, ethnically, it's a Persian nation, very distinct from its Arab neighbors. Religiously, it's almost wholly Shiite in a Sunni-dominated region.
That uniqueness, while a source of national pride, must also create this deep-rooted self-perception of being constantly under threat.
It does. It really heightens their security dilemma with regional rivals who, view Tehran with a lot of suspicion.
That blend geographical encirclement combined with religious and ethnic isolation, it sounds like a formula for deep-seated defensive paranoia, no matter who is in power. Let's chart the swing of this ideological pendulum with some historical examples.
Okay, the first major swing was the 1980s ideological zenith. The revolutionary motto was neither East nor West, only Islam. And this wasn't just rhetoric. It was a defining principle. The severe existential threat of the Iran-Iraq War.
And their intense diplomatic isolation.
It forced the domestic factions to unite under the overwhelming moral and religious authority of Imam Khomeini.
So the immediate threat of annihilation basically simplified the political system for a time.
It did. The consensus translated into this intensely ideological foreign policy. Khomeini's charisma acted as a vital balancing force, smoothing over all these internal disputes and allowing for a consistent revolutionary front. The foreign policy became a direct expression of that consensus, which was achieved under extreme external duress.
Then the war ended, and the survival imperative shifted from military to economic.
And that brings us to the Rafsanjani Détente from 1989 to 1993. The country was devastated. They were facing a $150 billion reconstruction bill. The dominant domestic imperative became economic recovery.
So they needed outside investment.
Desperately. And that drove a deliberate de-ideologization phase, a massive pragmatic shift in foreign policy toward neighbors and the West to seek investment and trade. Factionalism was initially suppressed because there was broad agreement on the need for financial recovery.
But that window of pragmatism didn't last long because the external environment turned hostile again almost immediately.
It was very short-lived. By the mid-90s, you see the return of confrontation. The U.S. introduced its dual containment policy, aiming to isolate both Iran and Iraq. And even more critically, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process attempts, like the 1991 Madrid Conference, they excluded Iran entirely.
And Tehran interpreted that exclusion as a deliberate, coordinated threat.
Absolutely. This challenging external environment triggered a political shift. Rafsanjani's pragmatic power started to decline, factionalism grew intense again, and the conservatives regained ground. Iran, fearing encirclement and isolation, went right back to more ideological stances.
Trying to boycott the peace process, calling up the Islamist front again.
Exactly. This immediate return to ideological rhetoric was a direct function of that rising threat perception and the domestic fragmentation that followed.
And that pattern of external pressure fueling internal hardening, that seems to be the key dynamic. We saw it repeat later too, didn't we? Especially around the nuclear file and the JCPOA.
The cycle is relentless. During the Khatami era, his pragmatic dialogue of civilizations approach initially lowered factionalism. Then 9/11 happened. At first, Iran tried to cooperate against the Taliban, a mutual enemy. But then President Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil.
And that accommodating environment just vanished overnight.
Completely. The external environment became challenging again, leading directly to the rise of principalists like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And while his first term saw surprisingly low factionalism because the reformists had been marginalized, the external hostility still translated into a very aggressive ideological foreign policy.
A lot of revolutionary rhetoric against the U.S. and Israel.
Right. But even that ideological rigidity eventually broke down because of domestic imperatives. The economy. By Ahmadinejad's second term, factionalism grew again because of severe economic deterioration and public protests. And this domestic pressure, ironically, pushed policymakers back toward looking for international cooperation to relieve the economic strangulation. And that paved the way for Hassan Rouhani and the negotiation of the JCPOA in 2015. So you see the constant cycle. External threat forces unity and an ideological response. Stability or economic pressure forces pragmatic cooperation. But the external environment, it really remains the master switch for that internal political battle.
We've established that ideology is often a tool used by pragmatists. So now let's pivot from political theory to the most concrete physical manifestation of Iran's current strategic priorities, the secure land bridge to the Mediterranean. If the rhetoric is pan-Islamic, the action is all about logistics. What is the ultimate strategic goal of this massive infrastructure project?
The strategic goal is layered, but ultimately it's about securing strategic depth. Iran is trying to reestablish a secure land bridge, which is essentially a network of main supply routes, or MSRs, from its own territory, stretching through Iraq and Syria, all the way to the Mediterranean coasts of Syria and Lebanon.
This is the ultimate expression of their forward defense doctrine.
It is. It's about stretching the front lines of any potential conflict thousands of kilometers away from Iranian borders. The goal is to ensure that if a conflict breaks out, their territory is the last to be touched.
But the scope is far wider than just military supply, right?
Oh, much wider. This land bridge serves massive long-term economic domination goals. It enables trade. It allows Iran to reliably circumvent sanctions by routing goods and currency through third countries. And this is key. It physically positions Iran and its allies in the axis of resistance to supplant the U.S. as the preeminent regional actor over time. The land bridge is the physical, durable backbone of this ambition.
So why is land so critical now? We constantly hear about the risks of these roads. Why not just rely on air or sea?
Because air and sea corridors, while they can be faster, are highly vulnerable and have been severely targeted by adversaries. I mean, think about the air corridor. It relies heavily on IRGC-affiliated civilian airlines like Kishim Air, Caspian Air, and especially Mahan Air, all of which are under rigorous sanctions and monitoring.
And we've seen those corridors disrupted repeatedly.
We have. There have been aggressive efforts to disrupt the air bridge in Syria. For instance, in June 2022, Israeli airstrikes severely damaged both the military and civilian runways at Damascus International Airport.
So once the civilian runway was pressed into service for military supplies, it became a target too.
It did, and that forced diversions to secondary airports like Aleppo and Latakia, which means Iran is often forced to use smaller aircraft or even resort to smuggling weapons components like advanced missile parts disguised in ordinary passenger luggage through Damascus and Beirut.
That significantly limits the volume and the size of what they can move.
Precisely. And sea corridors are slow, they're long, they're heavily monitored, especially on choke points like the Red Sea. Land MSRs, while not immune to attack, offer a critical logistical advantage. You can move larger, less broken down loads of heavier material.
Like fully assembled missile launchers or disassembled drones. Stuff you can't just put in a suitcase.
Exactly, or massive construction equipment. The shift in priority to land routes shows a strategic realization that physical infrastructure is the key to sustainable regional power.
Let's get granular about these routes. What does this physical control look like on the map, particularly as it goes through Iraq?
The primary focus is securing the road logistics that connect Iran to Al-Bukamal, which is the critical crossing point on the Syria-Iraq border. A key set of routes, often called the northern option, starts near Tehran and uses border crossings like Khosrabi or Zarna.
And how does that northern route snake through Iraq to stay secure?
From those crossings, the route goes into Iraq, but it strategically bypasses Baghdad and the heavily contested central areas. Instead, it travels through Al-Anbar province to the west, eventually connecting to the main Route 4 and heading directly toward the Syrian border.
And that whole area is a smuggling hub.
It's notorious.
Yeah.
The area around the Khosrabi crossing is used to smuggle every kind of good into Iraq, often completely unchecked because of political directives to security forces not to interfere with certain convoys.
Okay, so once they reach the border, the absolute linchpin is Al-Bukamal. Who controls that hub, and what level of investment have they poured into it?
Al-Bukamal is the center of gravity for the entire corridor. It's controlled primarily by associates of the radical Shiite axis, specifically powerful Iraqi Hezbollah militias like Liwa 45 and Liwa 13.
And IRGC commanders are on the ground.
Right. Quds Force officers like Haj Asghar maintain overall military command of the militias in the area. And the level of investment there just confirms its long-term strategic value.
So give us the concrete details. What did they actually build?
The most significant site is the Imam Ali military base near Al-Bukamal. This is the largest and most central base in the entire region. Since 2019, in response to previous attacks, Iran began a massive engineering effort there. They've been digging tunnels at the base.
Tunnels large enough for a truck to drive through. That's not just a staging area, that's dedication.
It's maximum dedication to survivability. The base features at least 60 reinforced bunkers and tunnels capable of storing heavy weapons, including ballistic missiles. It functions as a vital, hardened staging point for moving material onto Lebanon. It's a complex with multiple sections, air defense systems, and even potential cross-border tunnels into Iraq itself, creating redundancy.
That scale confirms this corridor is a long-term strategic priority. Now, on the Syrian side, what is the single biggest physical friction point trying to block all this movement?
The constant friction point is the U.S. military base at Al-Tanf. It's strategically located near the Iraq-Syria-Jordan tri-border.
And its presence just physically blocks the shorter southern routes.
It does. It renders them non-viable, which has led to continuous clashes, UAV, and rocket attacks against the base by the IRGC and Iraqi militias. So the U.S. forces Iran to use the more vulnerable northern route through Al-Bukamal, which is exactly why Iran had to spend so much hardening that hub. It's a strategic trade-off forced by physical geography.
And they are thinking decades ahead. You mentioned dual-use economic infrastructure.
Precisely. They are investing heavily in permanent infrastructure to facilitate permanent control, not just military resupply. You see projects like the incomplete Tehran-Damascus highway planned to be 1,700 kilometers long.
Merging military logistics with long-term economic penetration.
Absolutely. There's a similar railway connection underway, with Iran fully funding sections like the Basra-Shalom part in Iraq. These projects are intended to create massive redundancy, ensure permanent economic influence, and fully integrate the regional supply chain under Tehran's influence.
But securing this entire land bridge relies on the stability of Iraq, which is constantly under threat. What are the key vulnerabilities in that territory?
The first vulnerability is purely physical. The porous nature of that 1,000-kilometer Iraq-Syria border. I mean, despite official Iraqi government claims of fortifications, the border is routinely breached.
Which allows for smuggling and leaves these huge ungoverned desert spaces.
Exactly. Ungoverned spaces where remnants of ISIS still operate. They exploit these territories, mounting hit-and-run attacks that constantly drain Iraqi security resources and keep the MSRs vulnerable. But the second vulnerability is arguably more existential for Iran: intra-Shiite politics.
The rise of Iraqi Shiite nationalism, which is fundamentally contesting Iran's influence.
It is. The rise of powerful Iraqi Shiite leaders, most notably Muqtada al-Sadr, who champions an independent Iraqi identity, and even the moral authority of Ayatollah Ali Sistani, they pose a direct threat to Iran's control. Both have called for the disbandment of the Iranian-controlled popular mobilization forces.
So it's this enormous contest for the political and security identity of post-ISIS Iraq.
It is. It's pitting Iranian regional ambitions against deep-seated Iraqi nationalist sentiment. And Iran has to constantly navigate this fault line to keep its logistical lifeline intact.
The land bridge is the physical goal. Now let's discuss the engine, the axis of resistance. The sources suggest that following a series of severe military and political shocks, this network has entered a phase of strategic dormancy. That term sounds counterintuitive. What does it actually conceal?
Strategic dormancy is a deliberate policy of strategic patience. After some significant military setbacks, like the multi-front campaign against Israel that began in late 2023, and especially that devastating 12-day war in June 2025, where their capabilities were heavily degraded, the Axis entered a period of visible calm.
But it's not a sign of defeat.
Not at all. It's a systematic, aggressive effort to rebuild capabilities, replenish stockpiles, and, most importantly, functionally entrench their institutions into the host states. The pivot is away from immediate kinetic warfare and toward laying a durable economic and structural foundation for collective survival.
So, while the immediate conflict might have quieted down, the logistics, finance, and organizational departments are working harder than ever. What do these concrete rebuilding efforts look like for a core proxy like Hezbollah?
For Hezbollah in Lebanon, the efforts are comprehensive. They are actively rearming and replenishing their stocks via those Syrian land corridors, often in violation of ceasefire agreements. They're also moving toward a self-sufficient industrial recovery defense economy.
Trying to expand domestic weapons production.
Exactly. To become less reliant on immediate external shipments. But their key strength, really, is in cementing social control through extensive welfare programs.
They turn devastation into dependency, a classic state-within-a-state model.
Precisely. Hezbollah channeled hundreds of millions of dollars, $400 million in post-war aid alone, plus another $77 million in rent subsidies through specific entities. You've got Jihad al-Bina, which is their reconstruction arm, and Qard al-Hassan, their non-licensed lending network.
So they're strategically channeling funds to reconstruct bombed-out Shia districts into new, resilient strongholds.
And by doing that, they make their financial and social control indispensable to the communities they serve. This is how they maintain what they call civilizational resilience, by becoming the de facto service provider.
And the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, they seem focused on bureaucratic permanence within the Iraqi state.
The PMF's goal is pure state capture, but under a commercial cover. PMF-linked firms, like the Mohandi's General Company for Construction, are now dominating these lucrative state construction tenders.
And they're signing major corporate agreements.
They are, like a recent memorandum of understanding with the massive state-owned Chinese firm, the China Machinery Engineering Corporation, or CMSE. This transforms military leverage, the PMF's control over territory, into guaranteed political and economic resources that are integrated directly into the host nation's budget. It mirrors Hezbollah's success in Lebanon perfectly.
And the structure of the Axis itself has adapted, making it far harder to dismantle.
It has. The axis of resistance now functions less like a strict hierarchical hub-and-spoke model and more like a resistance network. It's a confederation of semi-autonomous militias,
sharing intelligence and resources with less direct day-to-day IRGC mediation.
Exactly. This distributed resilience means targeting one leader or one specific route no longer cripples the whole network. It's durable and complicated to target because it's decentralized. We even see documented military collaboration extending beyond the core with Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and even documented training exchanges with Somali al-Shabaab cells.
This entire operation must cost billions. So how does the Axis finance itself year after year under crushing global sanctions? What exactly is this gray zone economy?
The gray zone economy is the operational reality of the Axis. It's diversified across oil, embedded reconstruction, and really sophisticated globalized evasion networks. It is designed to function entirely outside the transparent global financial system.
Let's look at the financial core, the oil smuggling network.
This is estimated to be a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It provides over $10 billion annually in laundered proceeds to the IRGC Quds Force and its proxies.
And how do they do it?
It's an elaborate scheme. They use forged manifests, ghost fleets, ships that turn off their transponders or rename themselves constantly, and offshore insurance loopholes. This system disguises Iranian oil as Iraqi exports, or as exports from places like Malaysia.
And they route it through financial hubs.
Exactly. Hong Kong, the UAE, Malaysia, places where vast networks of front companies are essential for bypassing sanctions enforcement. They are essentially running a state-sponsored global shipping and financial evasion system.
And we hear about crypto.
Absolutely. Hundreds of millions of dollars derived from this oil smuggling are channeled through cryptocurrencies, supporting the global operations of groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis. It's all about shadow banking and non-traditional financial vehicles.
And the Houthis are generating their own revenue, too.
They are. They compound this by illegally imposing fees on oil and fuel imports into Yemen, laundering their profits via Iranian intermediaries. They generated over $5 billion between 2022 and 2024 for weapons procurement this way.
The IRGC's engineering arm is also central to this, essentially internalizing the costs.
That is the ultimate financial firewall. The IRGC's massive engineering arm, Qatam Al-Anbiya, monopolizes foreign construction and reconstruction contracts in key alignment zones like Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria.
Which is a brilliant strategic move.
It is, because it functions as commercial cover to export influence and insert personnel, and then they use the profits from state-controlled monopolies to fund foreign Axis members. Crucially, this internalizes the costs of their regional strategy. They don't have to rely on transparent public taxation, which insulates the system from domestic political scrutiny.
This intense focus on economic survival and reconstruction must have fundamentally altered the underlying ideology. How has Iran recalibrated its revolutionary doctrine to justify this economic focus?
Iran's ideological project has subtly but profoundly redefined resistance as endurance. The revolutionary doctrine now equates economic productivity, self-sufficiency, and just moral steadfastness under sanctions with jihad.
So negotiating a construction contract or managing a welfare program isn't secular governance. It's what they call jihadi management in action.
And fiercely. Official narratives, reinforced by clerical networks, praise this blending of hard pragmatism with divine mission. They are told that diplomacy, production, and community welfare are all acts of holy struggle. This narrative transforms economic hardship under sanctions into proof of divine purpose and strategic success.
It's an institutionalized architecture.
It is. It melds social provision and militia governance, creating a powerful shared moral grammar that legitimizes the Axis's resilience across borders.
But surely the sustained external spending financed through these gray zone economies creates tension back home. Is the public fully accepting the cost of this access?
No. And this is a serious long-term structural constraint. There is widespread, visible public fatigue and cost sensitivity inside Iran. Reform-minded economists and critics frequently argue in public forums that this strategic depth through proxies is a massive fiscal drain on the Iranian economy.
Especially with high inflation and youth unemployment.
Exactly. While the IRGC uses its monopolies like Qatam Al-Anbiya to obscure the costs, sustained public questioning of external spending remains the most serious long-term limitation on Iran's ability to finance and sustain this vast network indefinitely.
We've documented the hard facts of Iran's actions. The logistics, the gray economy, the decentralized proxies. This reality often conflicts with the dominant Western narrative that simplifies Iran as an aggressive, expansionist power driven purely by ideological zeal. Let's start with that dominant narrative so we can properly contrast it. What is the core thesis of the aggressive expansionist viewpoint?
The standard narrative, often advanced by regional rivals and certain Western policymakers, posits that Iran seeks regional hegemony, the establishment of a so-called Shia crescent. This drive, critics argue, is compelled by the revolutionary doctrine of velayat-e-faqih, which mandates the exportation of its ideals beyond Iran's borders.
Which inherently makes Tehran a revisionist state seeking to overturn the regional order. In this view, Tehran is actively seeking to dominate the Arab world, using sectarian identity as its primary weapon.
Correct. This view interprets Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iraqi militias as a deliberate strategy to create an arc of influence, allowing Tehran to project power deep into the Levant and challenge the U.S. regional status quo.
And the nuclear program is the capstone. How is the nuclear ambition framed within this expansionist thesis?
It's viewed as creating a nuclear shield. The idea is that possessing nuclear weapons, or even just a latent capability, would liberate the regime from the fear of retaliation. This impunity, the critics argue, would allow Iran to pursue its aggressive revisionist agenda and fund proxies with far greater freedom, cementing its position as an unchallengeable regional hegemon.
That is a coherent, if alarming, picture.
Oh.
But we must now examine the powerful counterargument drawn from structural international relations theory, defensive realism. How does this perspective fundamentally reframe Iran's behavior?
Defensive realism posits that in the anarchic international system, where there's no overarching authority to guarantee security, the primary overriding motivation of any state is pure survival, not power maximization.
So from this viewpoint, Iran's actions are rational, calculated responses to severe, persistent existential threats.
Right. Threats and structural realities that would exist irrespective of its revolutionary ideology. The theory argues that aggressive expansion actually upsets the balance of power and ultimately decreases the state's security by provoking overwhelming counter-coalitions.
So Iran's regional maneuvers aren't about conquering the region. They are about guaranteeing that the state lives to see tomorrow. What does the threat matrix look like from Tehran's point of view that validates this defensive stance?
Well, the threat matrix is acute. It's characterized by structural vulnerability. First, encirclement. Iran faces unprecedented military encirclement by the U.S. and its allies. There are over 40,000 U.S. military personnel stationed in immediate peripheral bases in Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar.
All within tactical strike range of Iran's borders. That level of troop deployment in its backyard creates an existential sense of siege.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Second, there's the nuclear reality. Iran faces adversaries, specifically Israel, with an estimated 90 nuclear warheads. Yet Iran operates without the protection of any major alliance like NATO. Its strategic isolation leaves it with few credible alternatives but to pursue asymmetric means of defense and deterrence.
Which is what states in that position have historically done.
Exactly. And this structural reality is intensified by historical trauma, that never again mindset. The experience of standing entirely alone during the brutal Iran-Iraq War solidified a national mentality that prioritizes self-reliance and asymmetric deterrence over any faith in international law or diplomatic guarantees.
So let's apply this defensive realist lens to the most controversial policies. How do you reinterpret the proxy groups?
Support for groups like Hezbollah or Hamas is framed as forward defense or asymmetric balancing. Iran knows it cannot match its rivals conventionally. Their defense spending is massive, they have U.S. backing.
So it uses proxies to establish deterrent capability that is cheap, deniable, and stretches the front lines away from Iranian soil.
Correct. Hezbollah, for example, originated as a direct reaction to the 1982 Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. This theory frames that not as Iranian aggression, but as a necessary counterforce to foreign invasion and conventional superiority.
So the Shia crescent narrative is reduced to a function of deterrence establishing strategic depth in a hostile neighborhood. But critics would point to Iran's aggressive rhetoric and say, if it was purely defensive, why spend so much on advanced missile technology?
You have to look at the sheer military scale. Iran's military budget in 2024 was approximately $7.9 billion. This is a crucial metric. Compare that to Saudi Arabia's defense budget of $80.3 billion, or Israel's $46.5 billion.
It's a modest fraction, less than 10% of Saudi Arabia's.
It is. And this modest level of spending is profoundly inconsistent with the behavior of a state genuinely pursuing aggressive regional hegemony. If Iran were truly trying to conquer the region, the numbers suggest it would be dramatically outspent and incapable of achieving its goals through conventional means. Its focus is on cheap, asymmetric deterrence.
That numerical comparison is perhaps the strongest piece of evidence for the defensive realism argument. But if the actions are purely defensive, why does it result in the security spiral and conflict we see today?
This is where the security dilemma comes into play. The cycle of misperception. Iran's development of defensive measures, its missile development, its support for allies to deter an attack, is constantly and immediately interpreted as offensive by its rivals.
And that fuels a cycle of mistrust and escalation.
It does. Iran acts to enhance its security, but its rivals see this as aggression, leading them to counterbalance with, say, increased U.S. military presence or Israeli strikes, which in turn validates Tehran's worst fears and perpetuates its insecurity. It's a textbook case where structural anarchy, not unique revolutionary fervor, drives the escalation. The argument is that characterizing Iran's self-defensive measures as inherently aggressive ignores the structural pressures that any state would face in its uniquely vulnerable position.
Yeah, the recent series of military and political shocks, the intense 12-day war with Israel, the institutional damage to Hezbollah, the volatile political changes in Syria, they must have severely damaged Iran's immediate capacity for conflict. If Iran is driven by defensive realism, how has this reduced margin for error changed their strategic approach?
Well, these shocks have compelled Iran to adopt a highly calculating rational policy shift. The damage to their capabilities and the loss of key direct levers. It necessitates a reduction in their strategic burden. The most rational short-term strategy is buck passing.
Deliberately shifting the frontline costs of balancing threats onto other regional actors.
Exactly. Shifting the cost to conserve its own damaged capabilities. Iran needs time. Time to rebuild its missile production, restore damaged proxy networks, and reassess its escalation thresholds after major defeats. Tehran is making a calculated bet that the structural dynamics of regional hostility will compel others to do the heavy lifting of containment against their shared adversaries.
Where is this buck-passing strategy most visible right now?
We see it most clearly in the post-Assad Syrian landscape, where Iran is actively exploiting Turkey-Israel friction. Turkey and Israel have profoundly incompatible interests in Syria. Ankara views the security of its border and the Kurdish question as paramount.
While Israel is focused entirely on preventing hostile capabilities from reaching its border and maintaining air superiority.
Right. So Iran can afford to become a patient observer, letting Turkey absorb the costs that indirectly limit Israel's operational freedom. Turkey is compelled to invest major military and diplomatic resources to constrain Israel in Syria because of its own border security imperatives.
And this extends to the core axis. Turkey is even opening channels to Hezbollah.
And this is a non-trivial sign of buck-passing success.
Yeah.
Turkey has reportedly opened contact channels with Hezbollah to manage the militant ecosystem in that crucial Lebanon-Syria linkage. By doing that, Ankara is effectively carrying the balancing burden, managing the potential for escalation without requiring formal Iranian involvement.
And where else are we seeing this strategy play out?
In the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea, Iran is capitalizing on Gulf rivalry. Escalating tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE military clashes in Yemen, rivalry over strategic control of the Red Sea, this directly weakens the coherence of the anti-Iran coalition.
When Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are consumed by their own conflict, the regional balancing burden shifts away from Iran.
And that gives Tehran invaluable time and space to rebuild. And this leads to that fascinating, albeit temporary, strategic convergence.
The Houthi convergence scenario.
Right. A plausible scenario involves a temporary issue-based Saudi-Houthi tactical alignment. It's not a formal alliance, but a parallel convergence. Both sides could, for their own different reasons, prefer to deter UAE-backed expansion in southern Yemen or contest any perceived Israeli strategic presence near the Bab el-Mandab Strait.
So, however briefly, it pulls major actors in directions that constrain Iran's primary adversaries,
making them passive allies in Iran's strategic downtime. But none of this reconstitution effort happens in a vacuum. Iran is heavily dependent on great power backing to make this strategy work.
Who is shielding the strategy?
Russia acts as the principal diplomatic shield. Moscow consistently uses its UN Security Council veto, provides crucial public messaging, and uses alternative multilateral forums like the Astana process to blunt Western pressure. Russia also provides indirect material support, advanced Russian origin anti-tank missiles appearing with Hezbollah.
And China is the critical technological enabler.
China is the key technological and industrial enabler of Iran's entire military recovery. Beijing supplies missile propellant precursors, guidance components, and crucial dual-use electronics that feed directly into Iran's ballistic missile, drone, and air defense production lines.
So they're compensating for Russia's supply constraints.
They are, and it positions Chinese industry as Tehran's main behind-the-scenes defense partner. It accelerates Iran's ability to regenerate its long-range strike systems and sustain its proxy networks without ever having to deploy Chinese personnel.
So the deep dive today reveals that Iran's regional strategy is not a simple choice between ideological vision and pragmatic realism. It's a dynamic, constant tension defined by the maintenance of a grand pan-Islamic rhetoric that simultaneously masks and justifies a highly pragmatic, result-oriented focus on physical logistical control.
That's it. The revolutionary language of uniting the Ummah is the political facade. But the operational reality is the painstaking construction of the land bridge, the development of a resilient gray zone economy, financed by smuggled oil and construction monopolies, and the institutionalization of proxy networks as a collective, distributed survival mechanism. Iran acts out of defensive realism in a brutally hostile regional system. Its current quiet posture is actually an aggressive adaptation, shifting the burden of conflict onto rivals, while institutionalizing its influence through hard infrastructure and financial resilience. The core conclusion is that Iran's power today is less about the ideal of revolutionary export and far more about control over concrete geography and logistics, ensuring regime survival through physical means and economic stealth.